I just smiled because he didn't know the surprise that awaited him at the airport. Sarah, a 34-year-old woman, stood in front of the old cabin, the freezing wind slapping her face and a feeling of bewilderment scraping at her chest. Her hands were cracked from the weather, her eyes tired from sleepless nights, and a silence that seemed to swallow the entire forest around her. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence that foreshadowed something dark, as if the earth itself knew that something was about to break forever. Stephen moved quickly, almost anxiously, as if he feared that something or someone would stop him. He dropped a bundle of firewood and 2 heavy grocery bags on the floor next to the hearth, as if he were performing an act of charity, so as not to feel completely miserable. His gaze avoided Sarah's, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame. She didn't speak. She still didn't understand what was happening, or maybe her mind refused to process it. She couldn't conceive that her husband, the father of her children, had brought her to this place in the middle of winter just to tell her what he was about to say. Stephen slammed the trunk of the car shut. The snow began to fall harder, and the flakes seemed to crash against the windshield like small blows of a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Finally, he looked at her. Not with love, not with sadness, not even with anger. He looked at her with that indifference, capable of breaking more than any scream. He said, "That's it. I can't go on with you, Sarah. I'm going to Rome with Lauren. The kids are coming with me." The sentence fell like a stone on ice. Sarah felt her throat close up. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't run toward the car. She just felt an internal silence, so deep, it occupied everything. Her body didn't react because her mind wouldn't allow it yet. She just blinked as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. She approached the car. She needed to see them. Her children were in there. Sophie, 6 years old, looked out the window with wide eyes, confused, clutching her favorite doll against her chest. Danny, 3 years old, had his mouth half open and was breathing fast, always somewhat sensitive due to his respiratory condition. The 2 looked like little birds trapped in a burning nest. She saw them for barely a second, because Stephen, with a mechanical and incredibly cruel gesture, pressed the button to roll up the windows. The glass barrier rose between mother and child without even giving her time to say a word, a goodbye, an I love you, or something that could embrace her children from the inside before he ripped them from her life. Sarah hit the glass with a trembling hand, not out of desperation, but out of instinct, that instinct that makes a mother run into a fire if her children are inside. Sophie said something that couldn't be heard. Danny reached out his little hand. The glass was faster. Stephen didn't even give the children an explanation. He didn't say, "It's for your own good," or "It's better this way." Nothing. His silence was worse than any broken explanation. It was the silence of someone who had emotionally checked out long before reaching that point. It was the silence of someone who had decided that his wife no longer existed. Sarah took a step back, then another, and another. She no longer had the strength to even hold herself up. The cold burned her fingers, her face, her breath, but no physical sensation compared to the ice she felt inside, an ice that expanded to her ribs. Stephen got into the car and started the engine. He didn't even wait to see her enter the cabin. The tires skidded on the snow, and he advanced clumsily, as if haste were his only moral compass. She watched him drive away. She saw the headlights cut through the trees. She saw the figure of her family disappear toward a life where she wasn't invited. She saw how the man to whom she had dedicated more than 10 years was leaving with another woman for Rome, taking what she loved most. And just when the headlights were completely lost, Sarah did something no one would have expected from a woman just torn from her own home, her motherhood, her life. She smiled. A small smile, almost imperceptible, but real. A smile that tensed her cracked lips and brought heat to her chest. She was wounded. Yes. Betrayed, of course, humiliated without a doubt, but defeated, no. Something inside her, something that had been growing like a seed of fire for weeks, ignited in that instant. It was a mixture of pain, clarity, and conviction, because inside her purse, very well kept, she had a folder that could destroy everything Stephen thought he had under control. She turned to enter the cabin, but before crossing the threshold, a freezing breeze brought with it a memory that detonated the true story. It had all started a month ago when Sarah found something she shouldn't have seen. Sarah had entered Stephen's home office looking for an electric bill. He always kept documents there among folders and envelopes that he organized with almost obsessive precision. It wasn't the bill she found. It was a sealed envelope with the logo of a title company she didn't recognize. Out of curiosity or intuition, she opened it. The document spoke of something unthinkable, a forged quitclaim deed, appearing to show Sarah had signed over her full rights to the property to Stephen. But he wouldn't sell it. Another person would, Lauren, the mistress, the woman for whom he was about to destroy his family. Sarah stood motionless, reading and rereading the papers, without understanding, without believing, without accepting that her husband had planned to remove her from her home, long before confessing that there was another woman. And not only that, he was doing it behind her back, using forged signatures, manipulated permits, and legal writings that had never passed through her hands. The betrayal didn't hurt just because of the infidelity. It hurt because he had already erased Sarah from his plans months ago. He was willing to leave her homeless, without assets, without children, as if she were a disposable part in the machinery of his new life, as if she had never existed. For 3 nights, Sarah didn't sleep. She had the feeling that the world was crumbling under her feet, but after the pain came something else. A clarity came that she had never felt. As she read the documents over and over, she understood that not everything was lost, that signature could destroy her, yes, but it could also save her if she acted fast. She looked for a trusted attorney. It wasn't the first time she had stepped into an office like that, but this time she went with a different determination. She brought the papers, explained what she had discovered, told what was happening. The attorney reviewed everything carefully and explained what she had to do. Sarah revoked all authorizations, all signatures, all permits. Every document Stephen had signed, believing no one would find out, was legally annulled. She also arranged something more important: temporary guardianship of the children in favor of her mother, Mrs. Alice. That custody would come into effect the very day Stephen intended to travel out of the country. The attorney was clear. Once the custody order was active, Stephen could not take the children out of the country without Sarah's legal authorization, and that authorization no longer existed. He had planned everything, like someone carefully placing dominoes, and Sarah, in silence, had pushed the first tile. Stephen had no idea about anything, nor did he suspect. He was so sure of himself, so convinced that they were about to start their new life, that he didn't see the storm Sarah was preparing. She finished remembering everything as she walked into the cabin. The old door creaked. It smelled of dampness, rotting wood, and loneliness. It was the perfect setting for a woman who had been abandoned. But Sarah was not a defeated woman. She closed the door firmly. She leaned the shovel against the wall. She looked out the window toward the road where the car had gone and said in a calm voice, without tears and without fear, "You don't know the war you just started." Sarah stood there in the middle of the silent cabin while the echo of her own words dissolved into the damp wood of the walls. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her lips, and her heart beat with a mixture of contained rage and an almost dangerous serenity. The war was declared, but it would be silent, surgical, meticulously planned. She wouldn't use weapons or screams or blind vengeance. She would use papers, signatures, dates, and a truth that Stephen was not prepared to face. The days leading up to the trip were a poisonous dance in which Stephen walked around the house as if he owned everything, as if Sarah were no longer there. He talked on the phone with Lauren loudly, without hiding, as if there were no longer a need to hide anything. Sarah heard him say phrases like, "In Rome, we're going to start from scratch," or "The kids will adapt quickly," while he reviewed itineraries on his laptop. Sometimes he corrected Lauren's itinerary with annoyance, as if he were planning a business trip, not the emotional kidnapping of his own children. Sarah, meanwhile, moved around the house calmly, without exploding, without complaining. It was the kind of calm that only a woman who has already understood everything and stopped begging possesses. It showed in her eyes, in the way she washed the dishes, in how she made the beds, in how she checked the school backpacks for the last time before the end of an era. Her face was dull, yes, but her thoughts were lit like embers. The night before the trip, Danny had a coughing fit while he slept. Sarah entered his room with her cell phone flashlight and found him curled up, breathing with difficulty. She rubbed his back, helped him sit up, and looked for the inhaler she always kept on the nightstand. She used it with the same precision of a mother who knows every second of her son's body. And while she held his head with her hand, she thought of something she couldn't ignore. If Stephen took him, would he know how to recognize the first symptoms? Would he remember how to use the inhaler? Would he bring the exact dose of medication? Would he know that the cold of an airplane cabin could trigger another attack? Sarah waited for Danny to fall asleep and then went to the kitchen. She opened the upper cabinet where she hid a small box of medications she kept just in case. There she found what she was looking for, a circular white pill that she crushed carefully between 2 spoons. It wasn't dangerous. She didn't intend to hurt him. She just needed to make sure Stephen slept deeply that night. In the living room, the television was on, but mute. Stephen was checking his phone distractedly. Sarah brought him a glass of wine and sat next to him, feigning normality. "I thought you could use some relaxation," she said, and handed him the glass with a kind smile. Stephen looked up. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to guess if that was an attempt at reconciliation or an emotional trap. "Thanks," he replied with indifference and drank. Sarah pretended to watch the screen while her mind went over the next steps. She had to wait about 40 minutes. The sedative would act fast. She couldn't fail because that night she had to access Stephen's phone and send a single message, one that would change the course of everything. When he finally fell asleep on the sofa, with the empty glass slipping from his fingers, Sarah approached in silence, took the phone from his pocket, and went straight to the messages. She searched for her mother's number, Mrs. Alice. She drafted a sentence that seemed innocent, almost casual, but which was in reality a legal declaration. "I'm taking the kids to your place tomorrow for a week." She pressed send. She waited for the read receipt to appear, and there it was, confirmed. That simple phrase was the final evidence her lawyer needed to enforce the emergency custody order a judge had signed that morning. Mrs. Alice had clear instructions. That notification proved Stephen had the children, flagging their passports in the federal system, so they could not leave the country. Sarah deleted the message from the log, locked the cell phone again, and placed it in the exact spot where she found it. Then she sat for a few minutes in the dark watching Stephen sleep. In that instant, she didn't feel hate. She felt pity. He didn't know it yet, but he had lost. Everything he thought he had under control was beginning to unravel from within. That night, she didn't sleep. She dedicated herself to preparing the final details. She checked the children's suitcases, hid a second inhaler at the bottom of Danny's bag next to his favorite stuffed animal. She placed a note inside with clear instructions. Use only in case of emergency. 2 pumps. She prepared the vitamins, packed books, folded the clothes with care. Everything she did was a caress disguised as a goodbye. At 5 a.m., when it was still pitch black, she sat next to her sleeping children. She stroked their hair, whispered that everything would be fine. They didn't tell her, but she knew. Sophie sensed something. Danny slept with a furrowed brow, breathing agitatedly. His little body felt the stress of the environment. Sarah kissed their foreheads and stood there between the 2 beds, with her heart broken into pieces. The rage for Stephen mixed with the tenderness for her children, the fear of losing them with the certainty that she was doing the right thing. Never had a woman been so broken and so firm at the same time. At 7, Stephen came down for breakfast as if nothing were happening. He complained about the coffee. He scolded Sophie for forgetting her toothbrush. He told Danny that in Rome they would see many lions. Sarah listened to it all with a calm that bordered on inhuman. Lauren called 3 times that morning, the first to ask if Stephen had printed the tickets. The second, to ask if Sarah had signed the supposed travel permission. The third, to say she was already on her way to the airport. Sarah listened to every call from the kitchen without uttering a word. Before leaving, Stephen left his cell phone on the table while he went to the bathroom. Sarah took it for the last time, and although she no longer needed to, checked the last messages. There she found one that froze her. Lauren had written, "Sure Sarah doesn't suspect anything? And the kids asleep with the pill?" Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. Stephen not only planned to leave with another woman, He had lied to her, yes, but also to Lauren. He told her he would give the children a sedative before the trip, that everything would go without tears or scenes. Hypocrisy had a face. When they arrived at the driveway, Lauren was already waiting in her car. She wore a very expensive white coat, dark sunglasses, and boots that looked fresh out of a luxury catalog. She didn't greet Sarah, just popped the trunk and ordered, "We're late." Sophie hugged the stuffed animal Sarah had given her weeks ago. Danny got in without saying anything. Stephen, nervous, put the suitcases in the trunk without looking at anyone. Before they left, Sarah crouched down next to the children. "Take care of yourselves. Daddy is going to take care of you. Don't forget Mommy." "Yes," Sophie looked at her with glassy eyes. Danny nodded without fully understanding. When the car started, Sarah just raised her hand and watched them go. Just like at the cabin, just like when they left her behind. But now it was different. Now the pain was a catalyst. Stephen didn't even turn around. He was too busy checking his watch, his cell phone, his planner. He had the illusion that the world was still beneath his feet. He had no idea that from the moment Sarah sent that message, the legal system had activated like a relentless mechanism, a system that had no turning back. When Sarah went back into the house, she locked the door, walked to the living room, and let herself fall onto the sofa. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the tension accumulated from whole weeks holding her soul together with pins. She hugged her knees. She felt a void that couldn't be filled, but she also felt something beginning to bloom, a sense of justice for having done what she had to do. Stephen, at that very moment, was driving with Lauren toward the airport, smiling, believing his new life was beginning. And Sarah, in the silence of the empty house, murmured to herself, "Today mine begins too." Stephen woke up remembering nothing. The previous night had been a fog. He felt something strange, but didn't know what. He got ready in a hurry, took his passport, kissed the walls of that house he no longer cared about for the last time and said, "Today our new life begins." He left the house not knowing that everything was about to collapse. The car advanced confidently along the highway toward Chicago O'Hare International Airport. In the passenger seat, Lauren talked nonstop. She wore sunglasses that covered half her face and an impeccable white coat that contrasted with the gray of the sky. She had dressed up for the occasion as if she were a celebrity. Expensive perfume, lined lips, hair pulled back in a perfectly polished low ponytail. She spoke of Rome as if she were already there, as if everything left behind no longer existed. "We have to take advantage of every minute. I don't plan on being locked in the hotel all day, nor babysitting kids, Stephen. I already warned you." He just felt tired, staring at the road. His jaw was tense. He had spent weeks believing himself the victor, owner of a new life, freed from the weight of a wife who no longer inspired him, and a routine that weighed him down. But for some reason, since he got up that morning, something didn't quite fit. He felt his body heavy, as if he hadn't really slept. He didn't remember the previous night well. Only vaguely the wine, the television, Sarah with that smile he didn't know how to interpret. It seemed strange, distant, but he didn't give it importance. What mattered was that he was a few hours away from starting from scratch in a new country with a woman who promised him a different life. In the back seat, Sophie and Danny were nodding off. They were wearing their thick coats and small backpacks with their favorite toys. Danny had a stuffed lion in his arms. He wasn't speaking. His breathing was agitated, as if the air cost him more than usual. Sophie looked out the window with heavy eyelids. Without fully understanding what was happening, Stephen had given them both a light sedative, a syrup Sarah had in the house. He didn't consult her, he just found it in the medicine cabinet. He thought it would be useful, that they would travel calmly. He didn't want crying, or questions, or nuisances on the flight, just peace. Upon arriving at the airport, Lauren got out of the car without waiting for him to help. She checked her cell phone immediately. "We have 2 hours until the flight." "Perfect. Let's go." Stephen took out the suitcases quickly. They walked through the crowd with apparent normality, but he was already beginning to feel a knot in his stomach. Danny started to complain. He touched his chest and breathed with his mouth half open. Sophie held onto her father's hand tightly, looking at everything as if it were a dream. Sarah had told them everything was going to be fine, but the air was different and Mommy wasn't there. At the airline counter, a young woman with a kind face received them. "Passports, please." Stephen handed over the documents, his, Lauren's, and the children's. The employee began to review them carefully. Stephen tried to look relaxed. Lauren was already showing signs of impatience. "Everything okay?" she asked without taking off her glasses. The employee furrowed her brow. Slightly, she turned the pages of the passports, then looked at the children's faces. "Sir, the system has flagged these passports. Do you have a court-certified custody agreement authorizing international travel?" Stephen let out a dry laugh. "I'm their father. Here are their passports. Do they have a last name?" "Yes, but per international protocol, both parents must authorize a minor leaving the country. I need to see the signed permission slip." The mother gave her authorization. "She signed it 2 months ago," Stephen replied, searching for the paper in his backpack. He found it folded, and with a coffee stain on one corner. He handed it over confidently. The employee received it, opened it, and examined the date. "This document was revoked," she said suddenly, looking at her computer screen. "There is a new legal resolution. As of today, temporary custody of the minors Sophie Mendez and Danny Mendez has been transferred to another person." Stephen froze. "What do you mean it's been transferred?" "I need you to come with us, please." A security officer intervened, approaching from the side. "Just a moment, sir." Lauren began to tremble with rage. "What kind of joke is this?" "It's no joke, ma'am. We need to clarify the situation with the documents." They were led to a small white room with a metal table and 4 chairs. Stephen was breathing fast. The children were still drowsy. Danny was coughing more often. Now a CBP officer entered with a folder, opening it calmly. "Mr. Stephen Mendez," he read, "in accordance with Resolution Number 398/2023. Temporary custody of the minors Sophie Mendez and Danny Mendez has been granted to Mrs. Alice Ramsey, maternal grandmother, effective this date." "That's not possible," Stephen said, sweating. Sarah signed the permission. "I have it here." "That permission no longer has legal validity," the agent said without raising his voice. The mother sent a message from her personal device, confirming the transfer of the children to Mrs. Ramsey's house for a week. That message was received and logged. "Do you want me to show you?" Stephen went mute. He understood everything in that instant. The wine, the deep sleep, Sarah, her calm, the message, the phone she had done it. She had beaten him. Lauren stood up from the chair abruptly. "This is a joke. We're going to miss the flight because of some legal idiocy. I have non-refundable reservations. This trip cost me more than I earn in 3 months." "Ma'am." "I beg you to calm down," said the agent. Lauren took out her phone and began to call, scream, send messages frantically. She was looking for lawyers, contacts, anything. Stephen wasn't listening to her anymore. He only saw his children. Danny wasn't okay anymore. His face was red. He was gasping. He clung to the stuffed animal as if it were his life preserver. "Daddy," Danny whispered. "I want Mommy." "Danny, hang on a bit, son. We're going to leave soon." But it wasn't true. The agent's phone rang. He answered. "Yes, understood. On the way." Stephen tried to ask, but was interrupted by a violent cough. Danny doubled over in the chair. His body was shaking. He began to wheeze. Sarah had been right. He didn't know how to read the signs. He didn't bring the correct inhaler. He hadn't foreseen this. "My son can't breathe. I need a doctor," he shouted. The agent requested medical assistance immediately. In less than a minute, 2 paramedics arrived with a stretcher. Danny wasn't speaking anymore. His face was beginning to change color. The air wasn't entering. Sophie cried silently. Stephen wanted to hold him, but the paramedics stopped him. "Leave him. Don't move him. He's in crisis. Use the inhaler." "Where is it?" He searched the backpack, but it wasn't there. He had left it at home. Or maybe Sarah had taken it. He didn't know. Lauren didn't say a word, just watched. Then she took a step back, another, and left through the door without looking back. Stephen called her, but she didn't answer. She didn't even turn around. On the security camera, an elegant woman would be clearly seen fleeing while a child suffocated. Danny was rushed away. Stephen was authorized to go in the ambulance. Sophie went with him, hugging his waist. She cried nonstop. Sarah, at home, received the call from her mother at 11:14 a.m. Her voice sounded firm. "I'm going to the airport. They already notified me. Stephen can't take the kids. Danny had an asthma attack. He's in an ambulance." Sarah felt her heart stop. She sat on the kitchen floor. She couldn't move. "I'm on my way," she said with a threat of a voice. She hadn't won. Not yet. Because when your child's life is at risk, it no longer matters who was right. And as she ran to get dressed, she thought of something that hurt her more than anything. Stephen had put Danny in danger, not out of hate, but out of negligence, selfishness, his own delusion, and that was something she was never going to forgive him for. Inside the ambulance, Stephen squeezed Danny's hand with a clumsy, trembling, useless force. His son's body, small, fragile, shuddered between agonizing gasps. His skin was beginning to turn pale, bluish at the lips. An oxygen mask covered half his face, and a monitor beeped with a rhythm that seemed increasingly erratic. Sophie cried silently on his knees. She hugged her stuffed animal so hard her fingers hurt. "Danny, son, please, hang on," Stephen whispered with his voice broken to pieces. "I beg you, God, if you are listening to me, take me, but not him." The paramedic, an older man with deep circles under his eyes and agile movements, spoke urgently on the radio, giving directions, asking for a clear path, requesting a resuscitation team waiting for them at the ER doors. Saturation dropping. "We need venous access. Now, fast," he ordered the other paramedic. Stephen felt the world crumbling. He didn't remember how they had reached this point, how a seemingly innocent decision, almost insignificant, like giving a pill to his children, had detonated this catastrophe. He remembered seeing the bottle in the medicine cabinet, one Sarah used to sleep during bouts of insomnia. He thought half a tablet wouldn't hurt. He thought it would be better for Sophie and Danny to sleep on the plane, so the trip would be peaceful. He thought of himself, of his comfort, not of them, and now he was paying for that thought. On the other side of the city, Sarah had changed quickly. Her heart choked. Her mother was waiting for her with the engine running. She got into the car without speaking. The words wouldn't come out. Her mind only repeated one phrase: "My son can't breathe." She had heard that phrase before, many times, but never with that tone, never with that fear in her mother's voice. During the ride to the hospital, she couldn't contain the crying anymore. Her chest hurt. She felt suffocated. The world had become a thick fog, full of distorted sounds and vague memories. She thought of Danny with his blue inhaler, of his sleeping face the night before, of his little body trusting her, and she thought of Stephen, of his arrogance, of his selfishness disguised as fatherhood. "I shouldn't have let him take them," she said in a low voice. "You did everything that was in your hands, daughter," replied Mrs. Alice with wet eyes. "What that man did was not your fault." But Sarah couldn't convince herself of that. She knew she had set in motion a chain of decisions that had ended in that ambulance. She knew that the sedative she used to put Stephen to sleep had also ended up in her son's body. Even if she didn't know, even if he used it without asking, the guilt crawled under her skin like a poison. When they arrived at the hospital, they ran to the ER. The noise, the white lights, the shouts, the stretchers, everything was chaos. Sarah looked for Danny with her eyes, unable to breathe properly. A nurse stopped her in the hallway. "Name of the minor?" "Danny Mendez Ramsey," she replied between sobs. "He's 3 years old. Came in an ambulance from the airport." The nurse checked a list. "They are stabilizing him in the resuscitation room. Wait here, please. I want to see him." "Ma'am, he's with the medical team. You cannot enter yet. We will let you know." Sarah collapsed into a plastic chair. Mrs. Alice hugged her, also holding back tears. A few yards away, Stephen came out of the resuscitation area with a lost look, his face ashen, his clothes wrinkled. When he saw Sarah, he stopped. She looked at him too with red eyes, heaving chest, rage alive in her throat. "What did you give him?" she asked without shouting, but with a tone that froze the blood. Stephen opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "What did you give my son?" Just a spoonful of that nighttime cough syrup from the cabinet. I thought it would help them sleep on the plane. I didn't know it would stop his breathing. I wanted them to rest, not for him to die, right? He lowered his head. The words stabbed him. I didn't know that. You didn't know anything. She interrupted him. You didn't know he has asthma? You didn't know he needs an exact dose? You didn't know that medication alters a child's nervous system? You didn't know anything because you never cared to learn it, because you were always a father in name but not in fact. Stephen collapsed against the wall, leaning as if his body could no longer support him. I'm sorry. I swear I'm sorry. Don't ask me for forgiveness, Sarah said, with a broken voice. Ask him if he gets out of this. At that moment, a doctor opened the door to the resuscitation room. He had his face covered with a mask, but his eyes showed concern. Family of Danny Mendez? Sarah and Stephen stood up. The boy is stabilized, but his condition is critical. He had a severe bronchospasm with hypoxia. We have connected him to mechanical ventilation. He is sedated. We need to run toxicology screenings. We found reactions indicating the presence of non-prescribed sedatives. Sarah felt a vertigo so strong she had to hold onto the chair. Stephen swayed. Is he going to live? She asked. We cannot give a prognosis yet. The next 12 hours will be decisive. The doctor left. Sarah looked at Stephen as if seeing him for the first time. Do you understand what you did? Stephen's eyes were full of tears, but he didn't answer. He sank into the chair like a punished child. For the first time, he didn't find an excuse, didn't look for someone to blame, didn't raise his voice. He just remained in silence because he knew he had done it, that his son was fighting to breathe because of his fault, that it was his hand that introduced the poison. Sarah entered the intensive care unit shortly after. Danny's small body was surrounded by wires, tubes, monitors. The mask covered half his face, and his chest rose and fell with an artificial rhythm. The image was unbearable. She approached slowly, took his hand carefully, and began to cry. I'm here, my love. Mommy is here. She was there for hours. She didn't move. Didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't blink, just watched him begging for a miracle. She thought of every instant, every small gesture of her son, his phrases, his games, his laughter. She thought of everything they hadn't lived yet. She thought that if he left, she would never forgive herself. Outside, Stephen was still sitting in the hallway with his head in his hands. Sophie was sleeping on Mrs. Alice's lap. He wasn't crying anymore. He had dried up inside. The image of Danny wouldn't leave him. His eyes, his fragile body, his voice asking for mommy. He had wanted to start a new life, and what he had done was destroy everything that had value. Sarah came out of the room in the early morning. She had an empty gaze, numb legs, a soul turned to ash. She stopped in front of Stephen. She looked at him. He stood up slowly, waiting for another burst of reproaches, but she didn't shout. This isn't punishment, she said in a low voice. This is consequence. And she walked away, leaving Stephen alone with the ruins of everything he had been. The hospital waiting room had become his cell. The hours didn't pass, or perhaps they passed too slowly. Stephen couldn't look at anyone, couldn't speak to anyone. Every word that arose in his mind was a stab, every memory a punch in the stomach. There were no excuses left, nor speeches, nor theories that would save him. Only facts remained. His son was still intubated. His daughter slept in the arms of a grandmother who no longer spoke to him. And his wife, the woman he had humiliated, deceived, and betrayed, was the only one now holding his son's hand as he fought not to die. He was completely defeated, but the day wasn't done with him yet. Shortly before noon, a man in a gray suit and severe expression presented himself at the hospital reception. He asked to see Stephen Mendez with a firm voice, showing an FBI special agent's badge. His name was Agent Austin Miller. When he reached him, Stephen looked up like a cornered animal. Stephen Mendez? Asked the man. He nodded his head, without strength to speak. I need you to come with me. There is urgent information you must know. It has to do with Miss Lauren Torres. Stephen stood up as best he could. The name pierced him. He didn't know if he should feel fear, rage, or shame. Perhaps all three at the same time. They walked to an office the hospital offered for legal situations. There, the agent placed a thick folder on the table with several photographs and printed documents. What you are about to hear isn't easy, but it is necessary. Stephen sat down. His hands were shaking. What about Lauren? The agent took a deep breath before speaking. Lauren Torres does not exist. Her real name is Helen Vance. She has multiple false identities. She is being sought by Interpol and national authorities for at least 5 counts of fraud, theft, aggravated embezzlement, and illicit association. Stephen went blank. It was as if the words arrived distorted, distant yet real. She told me she was an interior designer. The agent spread out a series of photos. In them, Helen appeared with different men in different cities, always elegant, always smiling, always with a different story. There were images in hotels, on yachts, in luxurious houses. Every man she had been with had ended up the same, without money, without assets, and with their lives torn to pieces. "You are number 6, said the agent, and you were close to becoming the first with serious criminal charges. Stephen felt nausea climb up his throat. What do you mean? The plan was simple: sedate the children during the trip, fake a kidnapping, send messages to your wife demanding a ransom, then disappear with all the money from the sale of the apartment. Her signature was already forged at the notary. She planned to close the operation while you were out of the country." Stephen covered his face with his hands. He wanted to scream, vomit, run, all at once. And the apartment. It was Sarah who stopped the operation, found the papers, revoked the authorization. From there, she began to build a legal fence that today saved your life. Literally, you were one step away from being accused of complicity in child kidnapping. Do you have any idea of the gravity of that? Stephen sat up suddenly, staggering. She loved me. She told me she loved me. Miss Vance studies her victims for weeks. She knows what they like, what they need to hear. You were the perfect target, a businessman in crisis, with marital problems, small children, and a partner in the process of breaking up. Easy to manipulate, easy to control. The agent passed him another document. It was a bank statement. "And this is the transfer you made from your account to a shell account 2 days before the trip. $400,000. You said it was for a renovation in Rome, right?" Stephen nodded slowly. "That account doesn't exist. It was closed the day after receiving the funds." A dense silence fell. Stephen looked at the floor, then the walls, then at nothing. He had no words left. "Where is she?" "We intercepted her this morning at an airport in Texas. She was trying to board a private flight to Portugal with a fake passport. She is detained. She refused to make a statement." Stephen let himself fall into the chair again. His body wouldn't respond. Everything was a nightmare. "Can someone tell Sarah?" He managed to murmur. The agent closed the folder. "She already knows. She was the one who contacted us. She didn't trust her story from the beginning." Stephen lowered his head. His pride had been ripped off like old skin. He thought he had deceived his wife, that he had beaten her, that he was starting something better, but he hadn't started anything. He had only been a piece, a tool in the game of someone who never loved him, who only saw him as an easy ticket. Hours later, Sarah entered the same room. She found him sitting still with his face buried in his hands. The agent gave them space and withdrew. Sarah walked slowly until she was in front of him. She didn't speak right away. She observed him with the coldness of someone who expects nothing anymore. Stephen raised his head. He had sunken eyes, withered skin, guilt tattooed on every line of his face. "What are you going to tell me now?" she asked. "That I didn't know anything," he said, barely audible. "That I thought she loved me." "And me? Did you ever think I loved you?" Stephen swallowed hard. "I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to look in the mirror. That was what you didn't want." She sat across from him but kept her distance. "Your mistress is a con artist. You almost killed your son. You left me homeless. Which of all those things do you think has an excuse?" Stephen didn't answer. He just trembled. "And you know what the worst part is?" continued Sarah. "That your pride won't let you accept that you weren't a victim of her. You were a victim of yourself, of your vanity, of your ego, of that desire to feel important. She only gave you what you already believed you deserved. I lost everything." No, you haven't lost it yet, but you're close." She stood up. Her voice held no resentment, only certainty. And I am no longer going to pick up your ruins." She left him alone again, but now it wasn't out of rage, it was out of justice, because she finally understood that she didn't have to save him. Stephen stayed there surrounded by papers, photos, and documents that told the truth. His truth, one he could no longer hide or make up. There was no doubt left. Stephen had just been a puppet, and finally he understood. Every memory, every feigned caress from Lauren, every word of affection carefully chosen, had been part of a script he didn't write. The emotional deception hurt more than the financial one, Sarah's silent contempt more than the legal charges piling up against him, his son's fearful gaze more than all the humiliations combined. The following days passed as if they were part of a punishment. He slept in the hospital waiting room with his head leaning on a plastic chair. He had no home because Sarah had changed the locks on the apartment. He had no car because he had sold it weeks ago to finance the new beginning with Lauren. He had no job because the scandal had reached his partners, and they washed their hands of him. Every morning he peeked at the door of the intensive care unit. Not to enter, he didn't dare anymore, just to ask about Danny. The doctors informed him with short sentences, without judgment, but with that coldness that weighs heavy. Danny was improving, but the emotional damage was unpredictable. It wasn't just his health anymore, it was his soul. When they finally moved him to a regular room, Sarah stayed by his side like a mother who has always been there. She read him stories, sang softly to him, cleaned his hands with a warm towel. Stephen watched her from the glass window. Sometimes Danny saw him too, but instead of smiling, he lowered his gaze or turned toward his mother. The bond was broken, and Stephen knew it. The day of the court date arrived without delay. Sarah arrived on time, dressed in a sober outfit, hair pulled back, and a well-organized folder under her arm. She showed no hate or resentment, just a deep tiredness, the kind of tiredness left by disappointment accumulated over years. Stephen arrived 10 minutes late, alone, wrinkled shirt, overgrown beard, hollow gaze. Mrs. Alice accompanied Sarah. On the last bench of the room, Sophie played with her doll, oblivious to the irreversible. The judge, a man with a tired face and deep voice, opened the file without preamble. Case number 3827/24. Plaintiff, Sarah Ramsey. Defendant, Stephen Mendez. Divorce, child custody, visitation schedule, and child support. Sarah stood up when called. "Do you ratify the requests of your lawsuit?" "Yes, Your Honor. I request full custody of my children, supervised visits for the father, and child support proportional to the income he had during the last 12 months. The judge nodded. Then he looked at Stephen. "Do you have anything to say?" Stephen took a deep breath. He wanted to speak, but couldn't. He just said, "No, I do not oppose. She is right. Everything she asks for, she deserves." The judge observed him for a moment more, then continued. "In view of the antecedents, the evidence presented, and the conduct of the defendant, the court grants total custody to Mrs. Ramsey. Mr. Mendez may see the minors once a week at court facilities under the supervision of qualified personnel for the next 6 months. Subsequently, it will be evaluated if a modification is appropriate. Child support is set at 30% of his declared income." The gavel struck the wood. The sound was dry, final. Stephen didn't move. Sarah didn't either. It was Mrs. Alice who stood up first, took Sophie by the hand, and walked out with her. Sarah followed her steps. Passing by Stephen, he looked up. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, but in that look fit everything they had said to each other, what they kept silent, what was no longer. That same week, Sarah signed the sale of the cabin where Stephen had abandoned her. The buyer was a young couple, newlyweds, who thought of restoring it and turning it into a country house. Sarah handed them the keys without talking too much. The only thing she asked was that they tear down the cabin in the back. She didn't want anyone ever to be locked in that place again. With the $400,000 recovered by the FBI from the frozen fraudulent transfer and full coverage from her health insurance, Sarah organized Danny's transfer to National Jewish Health in Denver, the best respiratory hospital in the country. The medical team offered an advanced treatment for children with chronic asthma. It would be long, expensive, but worth it. Her son's health was the only thing that mattered. 2 weeks later, the airport was full that morning. Sarah walked with a firm step, carrying a suitcase and Danny's backpack on her shoulder. Sophie, excited, didn't let go of her coloring book. Danny, calmer, breathed with difficulty, but was no longer afraid. Sarah had been his medicine, his refuge, his air. She always was. Stephen arrived running at the last moment. He had sold his watch, the only asset he had left, to pay for a taxi. His shirt was clean, but poorly ironed. He had dark circles, swollen eyes. Seeing him near the security area, she stopped trembling. Sarah saw him. She hesitated a second, but didn't move away. "Can I say goodbye?" he asked, with a broken voice. She nodded in silence. Stephen knelt before Danny. "Forgive me, son, for everything, for not taking care of you, for having failed you." Danny didn't answer, but looked at him for the first time without fear, only with a serene sadness. "Be good, Daddy," he murmured. Stephen felt something break inside him. Sophie approached with her sketchbook. She took out a folded sheet. "So you don't forget us," she said. It was a drawing of the four of them, Daddy, Mommy, Sophie, and Danny holding hands, smiling, as they once were. Stephen took it with trembling hands, put it inside his jacket, very close to his heart. Sarah gave him one last glance. There was no rancor, only compassion. "We're leaving." And they walked toward the departure gate. Stephen watched them move away, losing themselves among the crowd. He didn't try to follow them. He had no right, no strength, no words. For the first time he was truly alone, and for the first time he knew it was fair. Stephen didn't move from the spot. His eyes remained fixed on that last image, Sarah walking away with Danny and Sophie without looking back. There were no screams, there were no promises, there were no second chances, only the weight of the silence that the inevitable leaves behind. The airport filled with alien sounds, suitcases rolling, children crying, flight announcements, but for him everything had stopped. He walked aimlessly for hours, like a ghost among the people. He didn't know if it was 0 inches the evening or 9 at night. The clock didn't matter anymore. Time had ceased to make sense since his family left. The life he knew, the one he believed controlled, the one he wanted to redraw out of ego and vanity, no longer existed. Thousands of feet in the air, at that very moment, Sarah looked out the airplane window. The sky was beginning to turn a deep blue as the ship crossed the clouds. Sitting next to her, Sophie slept with her head resting on her shoulder, hugging her favorite stuffed animal. Danny, on the other side, rested with a serenity he hadn't shown in months. He was breathing normally. His little chest rose and fell with a calm rhythm. Sarah couldn't help crying. Not out of sadness, out of relief. Silent tears slid down her cheeks, while the landscape of the city she once called home faded on the horizon. She wasn't leaving behind just a land, she was leaving a story, a betrayal, a part of herself she had learned to let go. In that moment she understood something she hadn't been able to see when it all started. Revenge never heals, not even when it is fair, because revenge sticks in the soul like one more wound. Justice, on the other hand, cleanses, heals, and liberates. Sarah hadn't taken revenge on Stephen. She didn't need to. He dug his own fall. He lost his place in that family himself. What she did was defend what she loved, rebuild what he wanted to destroy. And that didn't make her cruel, but brave. She remembered the days when she thought she couldn't go on, the lonely nights in that cabin where he abandoned her, the fear she felt for her children, the cold that wasn't just physical, but emotional. She remembered how her body trembled while she wrote the legal authorizations, while she hid the papers, while she held back tears so her children wouldn't see her break. But there she was on that plane, whole, with her children safe, alive and stronger than ever. Sophie opened her eyes in the middle of the flight and whispered in a quiet voice, "Mommy, will we come back someday?" Sarah looked at her with tenderness, stroked her hair, and replied without hesitation, We will return when it no longer hurts, sweetie. When the past is just that, past. Sophie felt as if she had understood everything. She settled back down and went back to sleep. Sarah looked out the window again. The city lights were left behind, and with them everything she shouldn't keep carrying. There was no resentment in her heart, only learning. In the distance, an inner voice began to speak to her, not as a thought, but as a certainty. Maybe it was God, maybe it was her own soul. But it told her clearly, everything you lived through was not in vain. Every tear avoided an abyss. Every wound led you to the right path. Sometimes life breaks to protect. Sometimes what we believe is loss is actually salvation. And when you feel that everything is collapsing, remember that it is there in the middle of the dust where God lays the foundations of something new. Sarah closed her eyes, asked for nothing, only gave thanks. Thanks for having resisted, for not having become what hurt her, for having put her children first, for not having lost herself, for having trusted. The plane began its descent hours later. The clouds dissipated, and the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains began to be seen in the distance, with the glowing lights of Denver spreading out below. Sarah took Sophie's hand, then Danny's. The three together, united, complete, were no longer victims. They were survivors. When the plane touched down, Sarah smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was a humble smile of one who knows she has lost many things, but has gained the essential. The love of her children, the peace of her conscience, the opportunity to start over. At the airport, a medical transport team was waiting. A doctor with a kind face, who spoke with professional warmth and reassurance. She welcomed them, handed them documents, guided them to private transport. Danny seemed excited by the adventure. Sophie, curious, asked things in a low voice. Sarah just listened, happy that life sounded again. While the vehicle traveled the clean streets of the city, Sarah thought of her mother, Mrs. Alice had been a cane in the middle of the collapse. From a distance, she kept sending her messages, prayers, words of encouragement. Sarah remembered what she always said when things were bad. God doesn't arrive late. He arrives when you can't take it anymore to remind you that you were never alone. Now she understood. They arrived at the medical center, a white, modern, silent building. They were received by a young doctor who examined Danny with care and warmth. Then they were assigned a bright room. Sarah placed her things calmly. Sophie ran to the window amazed by the snow that began to fall. Danny fell asleep that night without needing medication. He breathed well, slept in peace. Sarah approached, tucked in the blanket, and kissed his forehead. She felt her heart calm. She turned towards Sophie, who was already dozing in a bed next to her, and whispered, "We haven't lost anything. We have won the opportunity to start over." She turned off the light. Outside, the snow kept falling, and deep in her soul, Sarah knew that although she had traversed the coldest darkness, God had opened a new path for her, one where she no longer walked with fear. She walked with purpose, with faith, with love, because sometimes what seems like the end is only the beginning of rebirth. If you liked this story, I invite you to leave in the comments what you felt listening to it. And if you have gone through a similar situation of deception, I would love for you to share your valuable opinion. There are many people going through a similar situation. We hope their voice lives in you. Share this story and be part of the change. Remember